Welcome to Chapter 11. Today we're going to look at agroecosystems and the difference between ecosystems and agroecosystems and how we use them in agriculture. Okay, so here's a little bit of an outline, just the 6 major things we're going to go over. We'll look at ecosystems, biomes, agroecosystems, what the difference is between those two and how biomes plays a big role in them. We will look at also risks that will be simplified through those agroecosystems, and then we're going to talk about a sustainable agriculture and why that's important for our generation to play a big role in for the next 35 years. So, some key concepts that I want you to walk away with here. The first one is when you're looking at ecology, it's really important to look at the big aspect of the relationship between the organism and the environment. So whatever that living organism is and how it's going to interact with the environment. So whether that's the soil, whether that's the climate, whatever that is, whatever that environment is, we need to make sure that we know how that organism is then has a good relationship with the environment. We'll look at some unique services that the ecosystem will then provide to not just that cropping system, but to also the consumer. And that's really important for agriculture, especially the way we're going to have to kind of turn the way we look at agriculture in the next 30 years if we're going to feed this world by 2050. So in that, we know what ecology kind of deals with, the relationship between those organisms and the environment. But when you look at agroecosystems, we look at how we manage these agroecosystems, whether that's a field, whether that's a pasture for cattle, how we manage that to produce food and fiber. Okay, so we obviously are going to harvest whatever we are growing. So when you're looking at that, one big significant factor that we have to look at is oversimplification. And when we oversimplification, when we look at that, we have to really understand why we are doing that, especially in ecosystems or agroecosystems. And that's a big challenge that we see, especially in the social aspect of agriculture in America, and then the ecological disasters that happen in America. Whether we know or understand them or not, they're happening, and they're definitely simplifying the way that those ecosystems then carry out their duties. And we'll talk at the end of this lecture about sustainable agriculture and why it's really important to know what sustainability is and how you and I can help with that. So that's really important, because we want to make sure that we're giving these next generations of humans the same respect that we have for our ecosystems, for our agroecosystems, for our livestock. We want to make sure that we're leaving them with better environmental resources than we had. So ecology, what is it? So ecology is just what it says there, just a science dealing with that mutual relationship among those biological organisms, whether that's something living, walking, or whether that's a plant. So whether that's an animal or a plant, an insect, microbe, whatever that is, we're looking at that relationship. We have done a really good job in our generation of looking at the agroecosystems, comparing it to the ecosystems or ecology, and making sure that we're having a good stewardship of the environment. So we have the EPA, we have a lot of different USDA programs for farmers and ranchers that will actually give you money, and we'll talk about this in class, give you money for stewardship of the environment, whether that is the stewardship of your soil, stewardship of your native grasses, stewardship of your crops, whatever that is. That's a really big responsibility that we have as our generation, and we should be proud of that, because we want to make sure that we're passing to the next generation a much better ground or ecology or agroecosystem than we got on the previous generation. So it's really important that agriculture's one of our top goals is sustaining that for our environment, for our future. Okay, so ecosystems, what are they? Why are they important? So again, we're looking at that relationship between the organism and their environment and what that whole function is. So if we have an ecosystem around a pond, what is that? What's the whole big aspect of it. What's the whole function of that ecosystem? So we're going to look at two different components. We're going to look at the biotic component and the abiotic component. So what I want you to kind of grasp your head around there, abiotic is a non-living component. So the sun is an abiotic component, or nutrients like carbon, water, or mineral nutrients. Those are abiotic components. Okay, so biotic is obviously living, those living components of the environment. So we could be looking at livestock, we can be looking at crops, secondary consumers, all of those different things that are living, breathing, and actually have that they're alive. Okay, so abiotic, biotic. And so the biosphere is really important in terms of the large ecosystem. So when we're looking at the large ecosystem, we have to look at those two different components and how they're interacting with each other. So as far as an agroecosystem, how are you and I, humans, making that ecosystem to produce that food, fiber, and shelter for agriculture? So in your book, it will show you, I think it's around 270, page 270, I believe, or 269 maybe. This is just a really good graphic that shows you a grassland ecosystem, so something that livestock producers would see very well. We're looking at those two different components of this ecosystem. We have the sun's energy, non-living, we have nutrients, non-living, and then we have our biotic components that are living, like our secondary consumers, our primary consumers, and then our decomposers, our organic matter, all of those things that make that whole ecosystem work and work well for agriculture or ecology. So what are some characteristics of an ecosystem? Here are the 5 main characteristics that we'll look at this chapter: food chains, nutrient cycles, plant succession, competition, exclusion. That's really important for grass plants and for legumes, and then diversity of those ecosystems as well. So food chains, probably the most popular in terms of how we look at ecosystems. So that's just going to have a definition of reflection of the flow of energy and the nutrients from that ecosystem. So from whether it's starting that food chain from our planet to our sun, and how that's interacting with each other. And again, those food chains are going to start with green plants or algae or something that's capturing that sun's energy, the radiant energy, and then convert it into a chemical energy. And then other producers, like the primary producers, consumers, and secondary consumers, will then start feeding off of that as well. So very important in terms of how that ecology system works and how important that is with agroecosystems as well. And then ecology pyramids that look when we're looking at the transfer of energy and biomass and how that can be integrated into agroecosystems. So this is a graphic in your book as well. It's just for those visual learners that you can see where the sunlight starts. Obviously, that's where everything begins, like we've learned last chapter. Then you go to the producer, which is going to be the plant. Okay, so the plant is going to be ate by that primary consumer. In some cases, that primary consumer could be a person and not a piece of livestock, or not a species of livestock. So if we are eating that producer right out of a garden, we would be considered that primary consumer because that's what we're eating. But if we are feeding that plant to a beef cow or a dairy cow, we would be that cow would be considered that primary consumer, and then because we are getting something from that cow, we would be that secondary consumer. So sunlight, producer, primary consumer, and then secondary consumer. So competitive exclusion, what is it? Why is it important? So the big term that I want you to know here is a niche. We use it because it's really important to describe that specific range of environmental conditions that include a lot of different things that we'll talk about, like air temperature, soils, precipitation, the species that's adapted within that habitat, so the species of grasses or the species of different plants, how that's interacted with that ecology system. We'll look at two species that cannot simultaneously occupy the same niche. Okay, so if we have two different species of grasses, it's not going to be within the same niche. And then, because of that, those plant or those animal species will then compete for those those resources, and then will be really good to adaptation, and then will prevail. The best will prevail from that. So it's kind of like the circle of life, if you will. You know, it's going to depend on the winners versus the losers, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So plant succession. So when you're looking at the winners and the losers of that kind of world, then we have to look at the plant succession and how that plant will then structure the way those over a long period of time. So if that specific type of grass or that specific type of plant will then protrude through that long period of time. And so this could take anywhere from 50 to 100 years. And that is, of course, depending on the climate and the species within that area, especially if that climate will change. Obviously, that species is going to adapt if it's adaptable to that climate. And then the competition of that succession and how our modern crop systems now, you know, especially the way we rotate crops, are faced with different types of challenges within that plant succession. So this is just a really good picture for your visual learners to kind of grasp your head around. So we have a pasture, and then 0 years, and then in 5 years we might have some mixed grasses or forbs in there. And if it's not being taken care of in an agroecosystem type or a agriculture type of setting, we're going to start to see some grass shrubs. We'll start to see some forest within 10 to 20 years, and then some maybe pine where we, in some cases throughout the country, and then it might become a pine forest 100 years after that because of succession and it's been abandoned. So someone has not been keeping it up to grow anything in, whether that's a pasture or a field that could be turned into a crop field.